Once upon a time, Riley Maybe carried glass, maybe case prop, through quiet museum of undefined feelings, because modern friendship apparently needed props. The prop was small, polite, and wildly overqualified for the simple job of helping people behave like people. Professor Crumble Clay, mascot, watched from a tiny side table holding a notebook with the calm concern of someone who had seen this ritual before. In this village, everyone believed, if nobody names the thing, nobody has to dust it. This is the story of the Situationship Museum, retold as a tiny clay disaster with excellent posture and questionable group instincts. Nobody said this belief out loud, because saying it out loud would make the furniture uncomfortable. At first, Riley Maybe tried being reasonable, which is a brave choice in a room full of feelings wearing party shoes. The tiny rule was simple: say what this is. It was not a law curse or a rejection letter with better lighting. It was just a human limit, standing quietly in the corner and hoping not to become a whole evening. Unfortunately, the village heard a tiny rule and immediately built a ceremonial problem around it. First, every exhibit is labeled complicated on purpose. Everyone nodded like this was normal, because social life rewards confidence, even when confidence has brought no useful tools. Then hope stands behind glass, pretending it likes museums. Riley Maybe smiled, the smile people use when they are trying to stay kind and not become a public service announcement. Professor Crumble Clay, mascot, wrote down one note: the mess was not evil, only extremely rehearsed. That is the special magic of modern social life. Nobody wants trouble, but everyone arrives carrying a tiny instruction manual for it. Soon the audio guide keeps saying casual with suspicious confidence. The room changed temperature by 2 emotional degrees. Someone suggested a compromise, which meant the simplest possible answer would now need snacks witnesses and a follow-up message. Riley Maybe looked at unlabeled relationship plaque prop and realized the prop had become a committee. The committee had no chairperson, but it had many opinions about tone. It also had a talent for making one small sentence feel like a national holiday for awkwardness. By the middle of the story, every person was technically being nice. This made the disaster harder to criticize, like a cake made entirely of good intentions and nervous frosting. The problem was not that people cared too little. The problem was that caring had been converted into paperwork with a cute face. Riley Maybe tried explaining the difference between kindness and unlimited access. The explanation landed softly, then bounced off 3 decorative assumptions and rolled under the nearest chair. Across the room, Professor Crumble Clay, mascot, lifted one eyebrow, which in clay language means the syllabus has caught fire. A tiny audience formed, because nothing attracts attention like people pretending there is no conflict. The audience did what audiences do. It became very invested, while offering almost no furniture-moving assistance. One tiny faction believed Riley Maybe should be more flexible, because flexibility sounds virtuous when someone else is doing the bending. Another tiny faction believed the situation needed a softer entrance, a warmer exit, and possibly a decorative basket for everyone's discomfort. Riley Maybe considered all of this with the facial expression of a person reading terms and conditions written by a candle. The strange part was that no one had asked for cruelty rejection or social exile. They had only asked for a normal amount of clarity, which the room treated like a dramatic weather event. Glass, maybe case. Prop sat nearby, doing the emotional labor of a much larger object. Unlabeled relationship plaque prop waited beside it, looking official enough to make nonsense feel organized. Professor Crumble Clay, mascot, tapped his notebook once, silently reminding the room that complicated is not always the same thing as deep. Then came the ceremonial over-explanation, a beloved village tradition where one sentence puts on 14 little hats. First, it wore empathy, then context, then concern, then a tiny legal cape nobody requested. By the end, the original issue had become difficult to recognize, like a sandwich wrapped in meeting minutes. Still, the truth stayed tiny and stubborn in the middle of the table. It did not require a villain, a dramatic exit, or a heroic speech beside a fake plant. It only required somebody to stop confusing discomfort with danger. That distinction mattered because social life often sells avoidance as kindness with better manners. Avoidance can look peaceful for a while, especially if everyone agrees to smile directly at the carpet. But eventually, the carpet learns everybody's secrets and becomes the most powerful object in the room. So Riley maybe tried again this time, without decorating the sentence, until it became unrecognizable. The words came out plain, not sharp, and the plainness made them surprisingly hard to argue with. A few shoulders lowered. A few assumptions lost their tiny uniforms. The village did not applaud, because real progress rarely enters with confetti. Somebody whispered that maybe say, "What this is sounded harsh." Somebody else whispered that maybe ignoring it was harsher, just less honest, and therefore easier to decorate. That was when the story finally stopped being about glass, maybe case, prop. It became about the ancient social sport of making clear communication feel suspiciously dramatic. For a moment, the whole village stood inside the weird little lesson. They could keep polishing the performance, or they could admit the obvious thing, sitting in plain sight. Riley maybe picked up unlabeled relationship plaque prop and set it down with the seriousness of a tiny judge returning a spoon. The rules stayed the same, but the voice around it got smaller, warmer, and less interested in winning. Nobody exploded. The ceiling did not collapse. The friendship economy did not shut down for repairs. Instead, one person blinked, another person exhaled, and the room remembered it had chairs for a reason. That was the miracle. The boundary choice or honest answer did not break the village. It only broke the little ceremony that insisted everyone pretend forever. After that, the museum learns that ambiguity is not a permanent climate system. The change was not glamorous, which is usually how you know a social lesson might actually work. Professor Crumble Clay mascot closed his notebook and gave Riley maybe the respectful nod reserved for survivors of unnecessary etiquette theater. The village did not become perfect. It simply became harder to bully people with politeness wrapped in ribbon. And glass maybe case, prop returned to its humble job, looking decorative, useful, and no longer responsible for everyone's emotional weather. Once upon a later time, an empty display case with one clean label holder. The moral was not complicated. A tiny, honest limit beats a giant, confusing performance. But naturally, the village scheduled a short meeting to discuss whether the moral needed softer font choices.